I first read Rich's script for this scene, one thing immediately stood out to me. Almost nothing happens. Edward Crowe reaches up and removes his eye patch. That's it. From a purely physical perspective, it's probably less than a second of movement, but from a storytelling perspective, it's the payoff to everything that came before. Throughout the story, Rich keeps asking the same question. Who is this man? Crowe never behaves the way we expect. He's always calm, always one step ahead. Even when he's standing in front of what appears to be the devil himself, he doesn't panic, he doesn't posture, he doesn't even seem particularly worried. You know he's hiding something, you just don't know what. Then Rich gives us this moment. Crowe reaches for the eye patch. As an artist, that's where my work really begins. A script tells you what happens. The artwork decides how the audience experiences it. I could have drawn him lifting the eye patch in a single image. It would communicate the story perfectly, but it wouldn't communicate the emotion. The important part isn't that the eye patch comes off. The important part is that the reader has been waiting for it to come off. Those are two completely different things. One of the reasons I love comics so much is because they're not constrained by real time. If this were a movie, this action would probably take half a second. The editor decides how long the shot lasts, and every viewer experiences exactly the same amount of time. Comics don't work like that. In comics, time is emotional. You can decide that a conversation takes 3 pages. You can decide that 10 years pass in a single panel, or you can decide that half a second deserves an entire page. That freedom is unique to comics. As artists, we're not illustrating time. We're designing it. When I started thinking about this page, I wasn't asking myself what Crowe looked like. I was asking myself what anticipation looks like. How do you draw expectation? How do you make someone feel like they're holding their breath? The obvious solution would have been to divide the page into lots of small panels, almost like animation storyboards. Each panel would move the hand a little further until the reveal. But this comic wasn't designed for a printed page. It was designed for vertical scrolling. That changed everything. Instead of thinking in panels, I started thinking about movement through space. What happens if the entire page becomes one uninterrupted image? What happens if time isn't separated by borders anymore? That's when the idea clicked. Instead of drawing one Crowe, I would draw many, not different versions of him, not clones, not echoes, different moments of exactly the same action existing inside one continuous composition. It's almost like those old motion studies by Edward Muybridge, where multiple positions of the body exist together inside a single image, or a long exposure photograph, where movement leaves a trail behind it. Except here, the movement isn't created by the camera, it's created by the reader. As they scroll down the page, they're physically traveling through time. Crowe grows larger, the hand gets closer, the eye patch slowly begins to move. The reveal isn't waiting behind a page turn, it's waiting further down the scroll. I really like that idea because it uses the format itself as part of the storytelling. If this had been designed as a traditional comic page, I probably would have approached it very differently. But I always think the format should influence the storytelling instead of fighting against it. Too often, we treat digital comics exactly like printed comics that happen to be on a phone. I think that's a missed opportunity. Every medium has strengths. Film has movement, animation has timing, games have interaction, comics have composition, and vertical comics have something even more interesting. They let the reader physically uncover the story. That became the foundation for everything else I did on this page. Before I worried about anatomy, before I worried about rendering, before I worried about colors, I was thinking about one simple question. How can I make the reader want to keep scrolling just a little bit further? Once I had the basic idea, The next challenge was figuring out how to make the reader actually experience the movement. Normally, comics rely on panels. Every panel is another beat in time. You look at one image, then the next, and your brain connects the two. That invisible connection is what creates movement. Here I had no panels, just one continuous illustration. That meant I had to build rhythm another way. The answer became repetition. Instead of separating moments with borders, I separated them with multiple versions of Crowe. Each one represents another instant in the same action. As your eyes travel downward, you're not looking at different characters. You're watching the same character occupy different moments in time. One thing I found interesting is that your brain accepts this almost immediately. If you placed all these figures next to each other in another context, it might look confusing. But because every pose flows naturally into the next, your brain stops seeing individual drawings and starts seeing motion. You're no longer reading images, you're reading change. That distinction became really important while I was designing the composition. I wasn't thinking about making each drawing interesting on its own. I was thinking about the transition between them. How much should the hand move? How much should the head rotate? How much should the eye patch lift? Those tiny decisions became the entire page. In an action sequence, the challenge is often making movement feel explosive. Here, the challenge was the opposite. I needed the movement to feel almost suspended, as though time itself had slowed down. Another thing I wanted was for the composition itself to pull your eye downward. In a traditional comic, the gutters tell you where to look next. Here there are no gutters. Nothing explicitly tells you where to continue. Instead, the repeated figures become arrows. Every crow points toward the next crow. His hands overlap. His body overlaps. Even the negative space between the figures gradually narrows, creating a visual current that keeps pulling your eye toward the bottom of the page. I wanted the reader to feel almost incapable of stopping halfway through. Because the page was designed for vertical scrolling, I also knew that the reader would never see the entire composition at once. That's very different from print. When you open a comic book, you immediately see the whole page, even before you've read it. Your peripheral vision already understands the composition. On a phone, the composition reveals itself gradually. That changes the way you design images. Instead of composing for a single glance, you are composing for discovery. The reader uncovers the image piece by piece. I found that really exciting because it almost turns scrolling into part of the narrative. Your thumb becomes part of the pacing. Every small movement downward reveals another stage of Crowe's transformation. It's a very physical way of reading. I also paid attention to scale. Notice how Crowe gradually becomes larger as you move down the page. Part of that simply follows perspective, but it's also psychological. As the reveal approaches, the character starts occupying more and more of the screen. He feels closer, more imposing, more unavoidable. Without realizing it, the reader is being drawn into the moment. Even the background became part of that idea. I deliberately avoided creating a detailed environment because I didn't want anything competing with the movement. Instead, the swirling organic patterns almost behave like a current, carrying the figures downward. They're not there to explain the story. They're there to reinforce the feeling. I've always believed composition should do more than organize drawings. It should communicate emotion before the reader consciously understands what's happening. If someone looked at this page from across the room, I would hope they could already sense that everything is flowing toward a single destination. That's really what composition is. It's invisible storytelling. The reader shouldn't notice why they're moving through the page so naturally. They should simply experience it. When composition is working well, it almost disappears. You're no longer thinking about layouts or design. You're just following the story exactly the way the artist hoped you would. One thing that quickly became apparent was just how difficult it is to draw almost the same image over and over again. If you're drawing a fight scene, every panel is different. Characters twist, jump, punch, and fall. Your eye naturally accepts those changes because everything is moving so quickly. Here, there was nowhere to hide. Every version of Crowe had to feel like the same person captured a fraction of a second later. If one head tilted too much, it felt like he suddenly jerked. If one hand rotated too far, the movement lost its continuity. I found myself making incredibly small adjustments, sometimes only a few millimeters, until the transition felt completely natural. It reminded me a lot of animation. Animators spend an enormous amount of time on what are called in-between drawings. Those aren't usually the drawings anyone remembers. They're the ones that make the key poses feel believable. This page almost feels like a collection of in-betweens. Individually, they're not particularly dramatic. Together, they create movement. One thing I always try to remember is that readers don't look at drawings the way artists do. As artists, we tend to stop and admire individual images. We notice rendering, anatomy, perspective, and brushwork. Readers don't. Readers experience momentum. If they're thinking about how well you drew a hand, you've probably interrupted the story. The drawing should disappear. The storytelling should remain. That idea affected the way I approached the line work. I wasn't trying to create my most detailed illustration. I wanted clean, confident lines that would keep the eye moving. Heavy rendering would have slowed the page down for the wrong reason. I wanted the reader to slow down emotionally, not visually. There's a difference. Something else I paid close attention to was the silhouette of the hands. Hands carry an enormous amount of emotion. A tiny change in finger position can completely change how a gesture feels. Since this page revolves around one continuous movement, the hands became almost as important as Crowe's face. Every finger had to feel intentional. Every overlap had to guide the eye. Even the spacing between the fingers became part of the rhythm. Color was approached the same way. I colored this page myself. My goal here wasn't to make the page spectacular through color. In fact, I tried to resist that temptation. The story already contains enough spectacle. What this moment needed was focus. I kept the palette warm and relatively restrained so nothing would compete with the movement itself. If every stage of the composition had dramatically different lighting or color shifts, your eye would jump around the page instead of flowing through it. Sometimes color should lead. Sometimes it should simply support. This was definitely the second case. Looking back, I think the hardest part of this page wasn't drawing it. It was trusting it. As artists, we're constantly worried that readers will get bored. We want to add another effect, another angle, another dramatic pose. This page taught me the opposite lesson. Sometimes if you've built enough anticipation, you don't need to add anything, you just need to let the moment breathe. And sometimes that's much harder than drawing another explosion. Working on this page reminded me of something I think about a lot. Every storytelling medium has its own language. Film has movement, music has rhythm, novels have the reader's imagination, comics sit somewhere in between all of those. We don't actually have movement, and we don't have sound. Everything is frozen. Yet, somehow, when comics are working well, readers experience both. That's always fascinated me. A comic page is really just ink on paper, or in this case, pixels on a screen. Nothing is actually happening. Crowe never moves. His hand never lifts. The eyepatch never comes off. The reader creates all of that. They're the final piece of the storytelling process. As artists, we don't animate the page. We create the conditions for the reader to animate it in their own mind. I think that's why comics ask for a different kind of participation than almost any other medium. Watching a film is largely passive. The timing has already been decided for you. Every cut happens at exactly the same moment for every viewer. In comics, every reader becomes their own editor. Some people will scroll quickly, others will stop on every figure, some will instinctively slow down because they sense something important is about to happen. The artwork doesn't force that experience, it invites it. I find that really beautiful. One thing I often hear is that comics are basically storyboards for movies, or that they're films that don't move. I completely disagree. If I had to adapt this exact sequence into a film, it would immediately become something different. The audience wouldn't have control over the pacing anymore. The reveal would happen exactly when the editor decided. Here, the reveal belongs to the reader. They uncover it, literally. Their own scrolling becomes part of the storytelling. That's not a limitation of comics. That's a strength. In fact, I think digital comics open up even more possibilities. Instead of treating the phone as a smaller comic book, we can start asking what kinds of stories only work because the reader is moving vertically through an image. This page was one small experiment in that direction. I don't know if it's the perfect solution, but I enjoyed treating the scroll itself as another storytelling tool instead of just a way to navigate the page. It's something I'd love to explore more in the future. Working with Rich was also a great reminder of how collaborative comics really are. People sometimes imagine the writer hands over a script, the artist draws it, the colorist adds color, the letterer places the dialogue, and that's the end of the process. In reality, every person is interpreting the story. Rich gave me the emotional destination. I had to figure out how to get the reader there visually. Then Buddy's lettering became another part of the rhythm, deciding where dialogue sits inside the composition. Later, Lee took over the colors for the final 8 pages, bringing his own atmosphere and emotional sensibility to the ending. Everyone is contributing to the same experience from a different angle. That's one of the things I love most about making comics. No single person owns the storytelling. The story emerges somewhere between all of us. Looking back at this page, I'm actually less interested in the final image than in the question it made me ask. How much time does a moment deserve? Not how long it lasts in reality, how long it deserves. Sometimes that's the same thing, sometimes it isn't. Crowe, lifting his eye patch takes less than a second, but emotionally it's the longest second in the issue. That's why it became an entire page. And I think that's one of the superpowers of comics. They don't measure time with clocks, they measure it with emotion.